All right. I have the pleasure of bringing up our next speaker this afternoon. He has worked for the UK Ministry of Defence for 21 years. Worked. For much of the early 90s, he was posted to a division where his duties included researching and investigating UFO phenomenon to evaluate the defense implications of the phenomenon. After taking early retirement in 2006, he was involved in a program to declassify and release most of the British government's case files on UFOs, many of which he wrote. He now works as a broadcaster and a journalist, contributing regularly to a wide range of TV news reports and documentaries. He's also acted and consulted He's also acted as consultant and spokesperson on several alien-themed TV and Hollywood movies. Now, as this conference goes, there's always weird cosmic stuff that happens at these conferences. And what's always kind of happened over the years is, without any forethought, it ends up that the speakers end up talking about things that support each other, and either like a theme kind of emerges out of the conference naturally. It's not planned, I can assure you. So I had no idea what Nick was going to talk about. However, I'm thrilled, because what he's going to talk about is the UFO phenomenon has come out of the fringe and into the mainstream. The revelations about ATIP, the release of the Navy videos, the reports sent to Congress have fundamentally changed the way the subject is perceived. But can the momentum be maintained, and how can it be built upon? So he's going to talk about what we can expect next. Now, if you were here for my opening remarks, I wrote those completely independent of the theme of Nick's talk, so I'm thrilled he's talking about this. So please join me in welcoming Nick Pope.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for that warm welcome. Am I supposed to be this side or this side? Does it matter?
We can see you there.
Okay, you can also. Okay. Well, thank you, Forrest, for that introduction. Very kind of you. And I'd also like to thank Nancy and Brandy and Adnan and all the crew doing the technical side of things. I'd like to thank everyone else at Ozark Mountain Publishing. I'd like to thank everyone at Best Western for their hospitality, and the folks at Murty Mays. And most of all, I know it sounds like I'm at an Oscar speech. Nobody slap me. Nobody slap me. Mostly, of course, I would like to thank two people who are sadly no longer with us, but whose memories and influences live on, and without whom we would not be here today having this conversation. And that, of course, is Lou Farish and Dolores Cannon. So, first of all, isn't it great to be back in person? I think everyone is so hungry for a taste of this. I mean, everything that's gone on in the last 4 years, a lot of which we will be getting into. And I think there's this real sense that we're, as Forrest said, and as the title of the talk is, out of the fringe and into the mainstream. I think it's so close now. There's almost this palpable sense that you could reach out and touch it. We're almost there. And I think what an exciting time to be alive and involved in this subject. And in particular, I think many of you will have had this. Many of you will have experienced this, I'm sure. That over the years, for those of you who've been involved in this topic for a long time, you'll have said something about it, and maybe even other people in your family, friends, social circle, at the workplace will have kind of rolled their eyes and maybe made a joke about little green men and sort of said, oh, you know, you're going to a UFO conference? No, you're the crazy people. What's happened over the last 4 years has shown that you're not the crazy people. You were the people who were right. And now it's everyone else who's probably coming up to all of you and saying, hey, I saw those US Navy videos. Hey, I see that Congress is looking at this. You were right all along. Yeah, please, tell me about it. And try not to be too smug, but enjoy the moment. Enjoy the moment. Okay. Let me crack on. First of all, I'm just going to show, I said how great it is to be back, not only live, but in person, doing a conference without someone pointing and screaming, you're muted, you're muted. Well, I'm not muted. And I don't know if everyone can read. This was a little cartoon. This was a little cartoon at the height of the lockdown. And for anyone at the back who can't see it, the two aliens have an abductee on a table, and the abductee is smiling, and the aliens are saying, "You're smiling? This abduction isn't terrified?" And the guy is saying, "Honestly, I'm just happy to get out of the house for a bit." As Forrest mentioned in his introduction, I worked at the UK Ministry of Defence for 21 years as a civilian employee, and the Ministry of Defence is the UK's equivalent of your Department of Defence. So it serves both as a policy-making Department of State on defence issues, but also doubles up as being the UK's highest level military headquarters. And I should say, I'm not going to talk any politics today, but I just want to do a brief shout out, obviously acknowledging the terrible situation in Ukraine. But for those of you who haven't seen, it was announced today that the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has flown to Kiev and is there. And he's there to show his support for President Zelensky and for the Ukrainian people in their darkest hour. But yeah, the British Prime Minister is there in Kiev. Oh, gosh. This is one of only 2 surviving pictures, I believe. We obviously, photography was not generally permitted in Ministry of Defence headquarters. This was actually, I did a small piece for the Ministry of Defence in-house magazine at the time. And so I was lucky enough to get this shot of myself with the real-life X-Files in the background. 40 years ago? No, not 40 years ago. But probably getting on there. Don't ask me to do math at this time of day. But what's kind of a little fun anecdote about this picture is that many of you who've seen the picture of General Roger Ramey, the staged picture after the Roswell crash, will know of the efforts to decipher what is on that piece of paper in his hand. And some people say that they have managed to discern words like crash and occupants and craft and things like that. I do indeed have a sheet of paper in my hand, but just to tell you how seriously we took security, our branch security officer had to be present for that photo shoot, and we had to absolutely make sure that all papers that might be photographed, even if you didn't think they could be read, all had to be at unclassified level. So, but anyway, it's a little blast from the past. This is, and I'm going to cover a lot of ground in my talk. We're going to dip in and out of what I hope you'll find some fairly fascinating things. But in line with this theme of out of the fringe and into the mainstream, this is a shot. I don't know how many of you saw last summer this program, UFOs Declassified Live. It was, I've done a lot of TV over the years, but this was quite extraordinary because you will recall, and we can get into this as well, that on June 25th last year, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence produced their preliminary assessment of the UFO phenomenon. And to say that that was an international media event was an understatement. And a lot of people involved in this field were just rushing from TV studio to TV studio, doing like little appearances on the news programs, but then doing longer, in-depth pieces. Well, this was unprecedented. This was 3 of the big cable networks, Travel Channel, Discovery, and Science, basically all got together and said, we are going to clear our evening schedule. We're going to all broadcast exactly the same program for 3 hours, and we're going to go into this. And you can see some of the people there, for example, Josh Gates and George Knapp and Jeremy Corbell and Jim Semivan. Yeah, so this was, it's almost like that old TV cliche, you know, we interrupt scheduled programming to bring you breaking news, that essentially these 3 networks for 3 hours just ran a UFO show. It was a real success, I think, and shows like that had a real reach.
Was it
Pardon me?
Was it scripted?
No. It was, we had subject headings that we were going to discuss. So, for example, the way it was done is that we did a section on astrophysics, and someone said, we need to talk about Oumuamua and Professor Avi Loeb's work at Harvard. We need to talk about the Navy videos. So we got a former fast jet pilot in to talk us through that. So we had a structure to the show, but obviously we were live, and we could pretty much play it by ear. Here's another person who's been, I think, a real force in getting this subject in the public domain. Tucker Carlson, always controversial, of course, but he has probably, I have been on his show, I think, 12 or 13 times in the last 4 years. And he's also had people like Lou Elizondo, Chris Mellon, and a number of others on kind of almost equally high number of times. Again, pushing this subject ever more firmly under the media spotlight. And I know this is Fox, and like I say, I'm not going to talk politics. There is no politics in UFOs. This is not a party political issue. And as Tucker Carlson is championing this issue currently on Fox, Larry King was doing the same thing on CNN some years ago. So this is an issue that in these polarized times, perhaps enables us to reach out across the political divide and shake hands a little, which is a good thing. I have lived in the United States for 10 years now, but in the UK, where I still obviously do quite a lot of media work, we just had on one of our TV networks something called UFO Week, which I was involved in promoting, and I was on quite a lot of the shows that were broadcast. And UFO Week is what it says. It's basically a whole week where they clear the schedule, and every evening they just run back-to-back UFO shows. It's kind of like Shark Week, but with aliens. And this was last year's, this is this year's. I love the graphics that they do for these kind of things. That was this year's, and that was last year's. And again, they even gave the alien a name. She's called Wilhelmina. It's a little piece of trivia for you there. Now you know. But the point is, again, that it illustrates this subject for far too long was smeared by some people as being all crazy stuff and fringe and conspiracy theory and sci-fi. And now we find we are in a totally changed culture. When the New York Times put this on the front page on December 16th, 2017, in relation to the existence of the ATIP program and the US Navy videos, I think one of the first reactions was that, of course, a lot of people said, hey, you told us you didn't do UFOs. You told us that Project Blue Book was terminated at the end of 1969, and after that, you didn't have anything. And now we learn about this. So, of course, we are now in this completely changed environment. I just want to unpack with you the ongoing controversy about the true nature of ATIP, because this is a debate where literally on a daily basis now, new information and new twists to the story are coming out. And I think David Marler might have alluded to this or covered a little bit of this yesterday, but bear with me on this, because I think it's important. ATIP, as many or most or maybe all of you will know, stands for Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. Now, associated with ATIP is AATIP, which is Advanced Weapon System Application Program. And according to the Department of Defense, ATIP was a program designed to look forward 40 years and to project what possible aerospace and weapon threats to the defense of the United States might emerge, probably from adversaries like Russia and China. So the official line is still that was the primary purpose of the program. Now, of course, people like Lou Elizondo say that's not what it was about at all. It was a UFO program. And Harry Reid, former Senate Majority Leader, who essentially was the key player in setting up ATIP, he said shortly before he died, no, this was totally a UFO program, and looked at some other paranormal things too. And so now one sees a little bit of I won't say a split developing, but certainly there are the people who talk about ATIP and the people who talk about ORSAP. So you have the ORSAP people would be obviously people like Colm Kelleher and James Lukatsky. And then the ATIP people coalescing around Lou Elizondo. But setting aside that, let's not forget that the DoD is still trying to stick to this line that this was not primarily a UFO program, although their latest public statement, of course, does acknowledge, and has acknowledged for a time, that they did look at some UAP data. UAP, of course, being government speak for UFO. I have a small part in the story of the nomenclature here. We, in the Ministry of Defense, did not invent the term UAP. It had been around for years. But we did, in the early 90s, adopt it. We essentially decided we needed to rebrand the phenomenon. Not with the media and the public, but internally in our policy discussions. It was very, very difficult to get FaceTime with SecDef or anyone senior if you approached their sort of military assistant or their private secretary and said, I'd like to talk to the boss about UFOs. It's like, right, okay. But if you said, we would like to talk about unidentified aerial phenomena and the ongoing situation with the pilots and the radar tracking and the forward-looking infrared camera, it's like, okay, you're in at 9 o'clock. So it's very important we didn't just do it for fun. We did it for a reason. We did it to jettison the pop culture baggage that came with the term UFO. And in June of 2011, I was at a private briefing in DC with a number of fairly senior figures, and I gave a short presentation, maybe no more than 10, 15 minutes, on the work that I'd done on this subject for the UK Ministry of Defence. And what interested some of the people there most was this UAP business and how it had fundamentally changed the conversation about the phenomenon within government, the military, and the intelligence community. And clearly, the tactic was noticed. And I mean, literally, at this briefing, sitting at the back was a retired CIA director, quietly scribbling notes, a former White House chief of staff, and a number of other very senior and influential people. And then I didn't think much more of this briefing for some years until I saw Hillary Clinton interviewed on Jimmy Kimmel. And Jimmy Kimmel asked her about UFOs, and she said, no. She said, there's a new phrase. It's UAP. And I thought, I did that. And one of the U.S. Navy spokespeople, James Gradisher, who before Susan Gough, or Gow, however you pronounce it, was the single focal point for all UAP questions going to the Department of Defense. One of the Navy spokespeople said, oh yeah, UAP, that's a term we borrowed from the British government. So again, yeah, we did that. And I think I won't spend too much time on last year's report, but because hopefully a lot of you have read it. It's freely available on the internet, on the Defense Intelligence Agency website. The unclassified version is 9 pages long. Just a couple of weeks ago, John Greenwald at the Black Vault obtained a still redacted, but a copy nonetheless of the classified version of this report that Congress got, which was about double the length. Lots of bits blacked out, but worth your time. And it went, John Greenwald got the scoop on that one, I'm pretty sure. So you can read that on his website. But I think a few brief but very important takeaways. When a lot of people, when they read that report, a lot of people in the UFO community were like, "Oh, that's really, really disappointing." And if you were expecting that report to be disclosure, as many people genuinely were, and that's the way some of the media were spinning this. They were saying, "My goodness, Office of the Director of National Intelligence, they usually do threat assessments on Russia or China or North Korea, and now they're doing one on UFOs." So the media was like, wow, what are they going to tell people? And a lot of the people in the UFO community were like, this is disclosure, this is disclosure. And I think some of us were saying, well, hold on, probably not, but it's a big move. Don't get disappointed. A lot of people were disappointed. I was not disappointed. This report, in many ways, went further than I thought it would. It made, here's what I think are the key points. Number one, there is no single neat one answer to the UFO mystery. Chances are a lot of different things are going on. Some of them may be conventional, others decidedly not so. Number two, it's not just stories. One of the most important phrases in that entire report was where it talked about how a lot of the really interesting sightings were detected across multiple platforms. And it said visual, i.e. literally, the military pilot sees it. And I love, by the way, Dave Fravor's quote on this. He said, "I don't know what it was, but I sure as heck want to fly one." These Top Guns don't impress easy, so that should tell you something about the speeds, the maneuvers, the accelerations. When these Top Guns are impressed, we should be impressed. But it's not just visual. It's simultaneously, some of these things were tracked on military radar systems. Simultaneously, and you've seen some of the films, they were recorded on forward-looking infrared cameras. Also, electro-optical, weapon seeker, and the list goes on. But it's a very important part of the report. Something that isn't in the report, but you can kind of join the dots and try and guess what's under the black ink on some of this. But obviously some of the most important questions that have yet to be answered about this revolve around military satellites. If ever there is a tool in our arsenal that enables us to get to the bottom of the UFO mystery, it is satellite technology. And you can't, the problem, of course, is that you can't have much of a discussion about military satellite capability without crossing all sorts of red lines in terms of classified information. But suffice to say, it's one of the big, generally unasked questions, which now, thankfully, people in Congress are beginning to ask because of the different parts of the US intelligence community that contributed to that report and are contributing to the work that is still going on, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But it was former Director of National Intelligence John Ratcliffe who kind of let the cat out of the bag on this. And it was a Fox News interview, and he said it was a casual throwaway remark, or was it? Or was it? Where he said, oh, you know, it's not just a pilot sighting here or something on satellite there. It's multiple times. And I thought, hello, what did you just say? That's the first time I can recall satellite technology being dropped into the conversation on UAP by Director of National Intelligence, no less. You know, so maybe it wasn't, you know, I sometimes think with these people, there's no such thing as a casual aside. These people are saying these sorts of things for a reason. Now, one of the things that happened, and this is the bit that I mentioned that I think David Mahler touched on, but there was a little bit of, I suppose, you'd call it a little bit of a row between the Department of Defense and the Defense Intelligence Agency this week. Because for those of you who followed the story, obviously for the last 4 years since the New York Times broke the story of ATIP, there have been hundreds of ATIP and ORSAP-related Freedom of Information Act requests in the pipeline. And eventually, of course, they all had to be dealt with. And in the last week or so, around 1,500 pages of documents were released. And they were released to people like John Greenwald, who I mentioned, Alejandro Rojas, Stephen Greenstreet, a number of journalists, Emma Parry at The Sun, a number of journalists and activists and people in the UFO community all had their extant Freedom of Information Act requests come to the top of the pile last week. And they pretty much, as soon as they got this, all the individual researchers started posting them. And then the Defense Intelligence Agency, I think it was on Tuesday, maybe Wednesday, put all of this on their own website. There's a part of the DIA website called the Electronic Reading Room. And it's an A to Z list. And on Tuesday or Wednesday, a new tab appeared right down at the bottom called Unidentified Aerial Phenomena. And you clicked on the tab, and there it was, 1,500 pages of material, some of which had been out before. So, for example, remember those, they're called DIRDs, Defense Intelligence Research Documents, the 38 studies that were produced for ATIP under the ORSAP contract. But there was other material too. Documents that showed the results of meetings between Harry Reid and Department of Defense officials, all sorts of documents. But this is where it gets interesting. So, of course, a lot of people posted, hey, the material's now gone up on the DIA website. Yeah, go, here's the link, and just scroll down till you get to unidentified aerial phenomena. Within a day, it had gone. And a lot of people were, hey, what's going on here? The what's going on here, of course, was that the Department of Defense is still trying to hold the line that none of this was UFO related. So, and so they're like, what I understand happened is that they got very irritated that DIA had used the title Unidentified Aerial Phenomena when DOD's position was none of this was a UFO program, or a UAP program. So they made them take it down. And of course, like all interagency rows in government, they kind of smoothed it over. I don't normally do this, but why not? I have actually got the email that I received yesterday from the DOD on this. So why don't I read it into the record? Where are we? Dear Nick, don't forget milk, bread, eggs. No, hold on. Okay, okay. I had asked, what's going on? And when are we going to get this back? So, this is the email I received from Sue Goff, Defense Press Operations at the DoD. Nick, DIA mistakenly selected UAP as the tab label for those documents. We are working with them to change it to a more accurate name. As we have said before, while the AATIP contract allowed for research drawn from a wide variety of sources, including reports of UAP, the examination of UAP observations was not the purpose of ATIP nor the AATIP contract. The new tab with the documents should be live on the site again soon, but I can't provide a more specific time than that. Ouch. I think the polite way to put this is that the DoD and the DIA are getting themselves into a real mess over this. And my guess, for what it's worth, is that the documents will probably be back up on the DIA website on Monday. I mean, how difficult can it be? They're not going to change the documents, they're just going to change the title. My guess is that it'll be up by Monday, maybe even before. And my guess is that they will simply go for the sort of descriptive comment, and it will say ATIP/AATIP. And the exact same documents that were up last week will be back. But that's just to give you an insight into, when I said this story is changing by the day with twists and turns. I mean, I wrote the presentation that I was going to give here a while ago, but obviously this is a kind of stop the press thing. Hopefully you want to hear about this stuff that's just happening. And keep an eye on it. Now, I mentioned, I mean, the DoD's position, as I say, is that ATIP was about next generation aerospace and weapon threats to the United States. And the DoD's position is also, though I think they may have to walk this one back too in the next few weeks, but as it now stands, their position is the only thing that was done under ATIP was AATIP. It's a contract, and it's a contract, of course, that went to Bigelow Aerospace. Here's one of their logos. These are the people that got the ATIP contract from the government. Do you think they're trying to tell you something? Robert Bigelow is of course, one of the very important players in all of this. And for those of you who haven't watched his interview on 60 Minutes, go watch it. And you'll love, I think there's two parts of the exchange which are really telling. The reporter says, you're interested in all this UFO stuff. Don't you think that people will think you're crazy? He said, I don't care. And I don't care. And so the reporter said, what, you're telling us that you think there's extraterrestrials out there somewhere? And he said, not just out there, right down here under our noses. Go watch it. This is their logo. And these are the people, as I say, that got the ATIP contract from the government. But obviously the debate rages on, and it is an important debate. For those of you who don't know what that is not some CGI image. It's not a prop from a sci-fi movie. It is an unmanned aerial vehicle called Tyrannus, built by the British. Hurrah, it's a real thing. That is a genuine photograph released jointly by BAE Systems and the UK Ministry of Defence. That's a real thing. And this again from the Ministry of Defence website. This one that's not real, but that was an artist's impression of what we were going to build as part of an Anglo-French project called FCAV, Future Combat Air Vehicle. No pilot in it, just remotely controlled, flying stealthily around the world and unleashing hell on the bad guys. So, if this is the stuff they're showing you, what's the stuff they're not showing you? Because depending on which aviation journalist you ask, aerospace technology generally runs 10, 15, 20, some say more, years ahead of anything you will see at any of the big air shows or on the evening news. It would stagger people to know, for example, when the first scientists in the United States and the United Kingdom started talking about the possibility of making a stealthy aircraft that was not detectable on radar. 80s? No. 70s? No. It goes way, way back. So, as I say, if these are the sorts of things they're showing you, there will be things out there now as prototypes being tested, but also probably operational aviation and weapon systems. Things out there right now that will probably look like they come from a sci-fi movie. So it is a critically important debate to have. Are some of these objects that we're seeing and that Navy pilots have been chasing and that have been doing incursions over some of the most important strategic assets in the United States, could any of this be adversarial technology, adversary drones? And watch out for that phrase, adversary drones. You'll probably be hearing a lot more about it as we move forward. And I think a lot of people in the UFO community are split on this issue, with some people saying, no, the speeds, the maneuvers, the accelerations are so extraordinary that this cannot be our own technology. It can't be Russia or China. If it is, we're in big trouble. It can't even be our own tech. But I would say two things. Firstly, most of the people making those statements aren't read in on the advanced aerospace programs that exist. So it may be informed speculation, but it is speculation. I don't know the top speed of the fastest aircraft that we currently operate, and I would suggest that very few people do know that information. I don't know the operational ceiling in terms of altitude. I don't know a lot of those pieces of information. So be suspicious when someone says to you, we can't do that. No terrestrial technology can do that. Because my question is always, and you know that how? And even if those statements are made by people who you think, well, they would know, like people on the Senate Intelligence Committee or the Armed Services Committee, what if some of this is a deception operation? Sometimes in intelligence, you do your level best to hide a capability that you have, but sometimes, frankly, exaggerate or even completely invent a capability that you don't have. Maybe just to waste a whole bunch of time, for all the Russian and Chinese intelligence officers who'll be working on things that don't actually exist. Or maybe for more intricate strategic plans. And then people say, well, if Russia had really advanced drones, they'd be using them in Ukraine. Not necessarily. You hear a lot of people speculate on what Putin's strategic aims are, but we don't really know what they are. And my goodness, Russia practically invented the concept of maskirovka, masking, deception in military terms. Yes, of course, all militaries do it, but Russia has it down to a fine and devious art. So with all of this, because one question, I always look for the questions that not a lot of people are asking, because sometimes those are the questions that take you to the more interesting places. One of the questions that I don't often hear people ask about the US Navy videos and the current situation in Congress with their interest in this, very few people ask the question, what do you think Russia and China make of what's going on in the US with UFOs? We know from intelligence sources that Russia and China, of course, have their own UAP programs. But what will, I'm sure, have caught Russia and China by surprise is the 180-degree pivot that the US government has done on this in the last 4 years. I don't know the answer to the question, but I guarantee that senior leadership in Russia and China have turned to their military chiefs and their intelligence chiefs and have said, what the hell is the US playing at? What's going on? What do we know about UAP? And what does the United States know? And here's the really interesting question. Why did they change their policy from one of denial and downplaying and debunking and deception, all the Ds, to suddenly talking about it in Congress, writing it into the new defense bill, for goodness sake, multiple UAP provisions in the new defense bill, telling all the different parts of the military and the intelligence community to properly get together on this, to draw up a science plan, long overdue, to integrate that science plan into UAP research. It name checks in congressional language, but it name checks a lot of things that people in the UFO community have been talking about for years. UFOs and nukes, for example. It doesn't quite say UFOs and nukes, but one of the things that is written into the defense bill is a requirement that in these regular reports that Congress now demands on UFOs should be itemized any cases where UFOs have come close to strategic nuclear issues and assets. So it doesn't matter whether it's the nuclear-powered aircraft carriers or whether it's the nuclear facilities on the continental United States. It's there. So it's almost like the very things that skeptics and debunkers were scoffing at years ago, you can now read it in the defense bill. And the DoD and DNI have to get together with other agencies too, and they have to answer those questions. And as I say, we go right back to the point that one of the first things in the preliminary assessment last summer was there's not going to be a single answer to the UFO mystery. So before we get too polarized with this debate, it is perfectly possible to imagine a situation where some of these things are indeed adversary drones and others are something else, something maybe extraterrestrial. That theory has not yet been taken off the table. That is my understanding. And it's clearly the understanding of some other people who have been actively involved in these programs and still have both working and social connections with people still in the system who are saying, yeah, absolutely, we have not taken the extraterrestrial hypothesis off the table. And that's massive. It should be massive news for people. This is another confounding factor here. So we have ATIP, and we have the DoD saying the only thing that ATIP did was ORSAP, and the only thing that ORSAP produced was 38 studies. I haven't listed all of them, but the list is out there. Anti-gravity, invisibility, stargates. It's the only time I have seen the phrase stargate in the Congressional record. This was actually because this list was the way this list came about, by the way, was that after the New York Times broke this story about ATIP and the US Navy videos, a lot of angry people in Congress turned around to the government and said, you told us, I know you told the media and the public you didn't have a UFO program, but you told us you didn't have a UFO program. What the heck is going on? And so about 3 weeks after the New York Times broke the story, on January 9th, 2018, DIA wrote to Congress. And they said, Dear Congress, you and your staffers have asked us about ATIP. And then they trot out the little line and they say, ATIP was a program looking at next generation aerospace and aviation threats and weapon threats to the United States, projecting forward 40 years to look at capability, blah, blah, blah. Didn't sound very interesting. Of course you would expect them to be looking at next generation aerospace threats. Right at the end of this little 3 or 4 line letter, it said, I have attached at annex a list of the studies produced under the ATIP contract. And this was the list that Congress got. Anti-gravity, invisibility, stargates, warp drive, wormholes. But still, and a lot of the papers, by the way, go into the technologies that you would need for interstellar travel. And, because some skeptics looked at that list and they say, well, maybe it's not quite as exciting as it sounds. I mean, people are working on invisibility. I've seen some stories, so is it that, far-fetched to believe that this is exactly the sort of thing they would be looking at? I was one of the first people, I think I was the first person to publish this, because I had asked the public affairs folks at the DIA if this was releasable when it went to Congress, and it took them about a year, but eventually they released it to me and I published it, I tweeted it. And I said the single most important thing in that letter is something which completely pulls the rug out from under the feet of the DoD, continuing to say this program had nothing to do with UFOs and aliens, because tucked away amongst all the sort of highly technical papers about technologies for interstellar travel was a paper on the statistical Drake equation. And as many of you will know, the only purpose of the Drake equation is to calculate how many communicable civilizations there might be in our Milky Way galaxy. So my question was this: if this really had nothing to do with UFOs and aliens, why the heck would you want to know how many civilizations there might be in the galaxy? Come on, man. Come on. Who's kidding who? This debate is still going on. On the subject of the Drake equation, I mean, Frank Drake himself, I think when he was asked, I know what the Drake equation is, someone asked him, but what's the answer to the, question? How many communicable civilizations do you think there might be in the universe? And I think, in our single galaxy, not the universe. And I think the answer came back at about 10,000, and maybe recently with what we now know about exoplanets, a number of people upping the estimate to maybe 20,000 communicable civilizations just in our one galaxy, bear in mind. In 2020, the Astrophysical Journal published a much more skeptical interpretation of the Drake equation. And they said, let's really bring the numbers down, and let's really assume that life is incredibly rare and all the sorts of factors that give rise to life. Let's bring those values down. And they calculated, and this is a peer-reviewed published paper, their solution to the Drake equation was that there might be 36 communicable civilizations in our galaxy. And then I pulled out my calculator and did the math, because everyone was like, oh, 36, that's not very high. Well, like one wouldn't be a pretty big news story, but 36 is a pretty small number. But I got my calculator out, and estimates for the number of galaxies in the universe vary, of course, but by some figures that you see on some of the most reputable astronomical sites, 36 civilizations in our galaxy would translate to, wait for it, 72 trillion civilizations in the universe. It's pretty crowded out there, but it's okay because it's a big place. I'm probably straying into areas where Mark is rolling his eyes and say, don't try and do astronomy. I'm probably mangling a lot of the figures here. Sorry, Mark. Anyway, the debate continues. I mentioned the science plan that's been written into what Congress has told DoD to do on UFOs. Have a proper science plan. My goodness, how long overdue is that? Any scientist who has ever worked for the government gets frustrated at the way the government doesn't really get science. And my late father, by the way, was a senior Ministry of Defense scientist, aeronautical engineer by trade, retired as Deputy Chief Scientific Advisor of the Ministry of Defense. We joked that it was the family firm. But he was constantly frustrated with government's seeming inability to properly use science and integrate it into government policy, but even to fundamentally understand what science is. And that almost, by a bizarre coincidence, or maybe not, echoed one of the quotes by Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who, of course, was originally brought in by the United States Air Force as Project Blue Book's astronomical and scientific advisor, but became increasingly frustrated. And certainly after Blue Book was wound up, went on, of course, to become actively involved in the UFO community as a writer, a researcher, a communicator, an investigator. And one of his very famous quotes was on the Lonnie Zamora case, where he just threw up his hands in frustration and he said, the Air Force doesn't understand what science is. But now, rightly, science is coming to the fore. And one person to keep an eye on is Professor Avi Loeb at Harvard. Actually, funnily enough, a number of the speakers and I were discussing Avi and the Galileo Project on our way up in the transportation from the airport on Thursday afternoon. Avi Loeb really, I suppose, came to international fame for his speculation that that odd-shaped object that definitely came into our solar system from interstellar space might not just be a funny-shaped, pointy rock, but actually might be an artifact of an extraterrestrial civilization. And he's published all sorts of peer-reviewed data on this, talking about the unusual characteristics of Oumuamua in terms of things like movement, change of direction, acceleration, etc., etc. So Avi Loeb has put together this organization called the Galileo Project. And the idea, as he puts it, is to look with fresh eyes and through new telescopes, not just for other interstellar objects like Oumuamua, but also for UAP and maybe for extraterrestrial satellites in orbit, perhaps polar orbit, around the Earth. So it's a multidisciplinary research and investigation effort. And I was honored to actually be a part of it. I'm not a scientist myself, but a number of people who have sort of other backgrounds and experiences, which mean that we can maybe bring something to the project, serve in the capacity as research affiliates. And if you go to the Galileo Project website and look at the research affiliate list, you'll see people like Lou Elizondo, Chris Mellon, and myself, and many, many others, far smarter than me, involved in that, just hopefully driving things forward. But this is something else to watch. I mean, I'm saying, look at the unfolding UFO story, but watch what's going on with science at the moment, and particularly, I mean, my goodness, I'm showing my age, but when I was a kid, when I was at school, I did a project. I did a school project when I was about 10, I suppose, on the solar system. And somewhere in the project, I had written something like, and of course we don't know, and we may never know, whether other star systems have planets orbiting around them. And my goodness, I lose track of how many exoplanets have been discovered now, but it I think, increases on a daily basis. So how far and how fast we are coming here is scary. One thing to watch is the Square Kilometre Array radio telescope. A project not without its delays, like most big international collaborative projects. But a telescope that will even put the fairly newly online Chinese radio telescope into the shade. All these astronomers love using analogies, and in terms of this is a radio telescope, of course, not optical. So, but to illustrate its power, some of the science communicators who are involved in this say, well, to give you an idea of what it could pick up, if you had a radar system on a par with the average airport radar system, the Square Kilometre Array would be able to detect it out to a distance of 50 light years. Now, there are about 130 stars within that kind of distance, but imagine if there are things out there, beacons, signals, constructed by civilizations with a 1,000,000-year head start on us or more. They might be pumping out something a heck of a lot more noticeable than an airport radar system. So when Square Kilometre Array comes fully online, who knows what it will detect? And I think this is, it's like the eyes and the ears. The optical telescopes, like Hubble, they are our eyes. These are our ears. This, of course, my goodness, the space mission of our generation, I guess. So much was riding on this single launch. Every astronomer on the face of the planet was kind of keeping fingers crossed, and still are. There are still some things that need to do, but everything looks good. Everything looks good. And again, with these analogies, the James Webb Space Telescope analogy is that this is obviously looking in the infrared. So it's slightly different to Hubble. But we all, of course, put out some body heat. The analogy that they used for the power and sensitivity of the James Webb Space Telescope is that, not that this could happen, but just as one of those fun things scientists like to say, if there was a bumblebee on the surface of the moon, the James Webb Space Telescope would be able to detect it. That just gives you, I think, an idea of the power of these tools that we now have in our hands. And there's another interesting, I'm going to, for the 20 minutes or so left, I'm just going to go and do some fun speculation. But before that, I mean, I think one interesting observation, it's a question. If a government keeps something secret, at what point does it decide not to keep it a secret? And I ask that because one answer to that question is at the point at which the secret can no longer be kept. And if we are about to unleash the Square Kilometre Array radio telescope and the James Webb Space Telescope, imagine if we're all correct about this and there are multiple civilizations out there, and unless we think there is something almost literally magical about planet Earth, we'll probably find ourselves to be quite an ordinary little inner rocky planet orbiting a fairly common type of star. And the Copernican principle, the principle of mediocrity, we'll probably find there's nothing particularly special about us, and that there's other life, some very different, but some remarkably similar to us out there. And perhaps we're just on the very cusp of being able to find it. And if anyone in government knows or even suspects this, what will they do? What they won't do is wait for somebody else to make the announcement. They will want to get out in front and ahead of this. They will want to drive the narrative on this. You don't want to be playing catch-up. How would you do it? Oh, I don't know. Maybe you'd spend a few years just drip feeding some things out into the media. Yes, we have a program looking at this. Yes, we've been looking at the Drake equation and warp holes and worm drive. And here are some pilots who've seen these things. Here are some radar operators who've tracked these things. Here are some people who've filmed them on the forward-looking infrared camera. Here are some intelligence community personnel who've been involved in some of these programs. The so-called acclimatization theory, the drip feed theory, the idea that whether it's through sci-fi movies or whether it's through leaks, the idea that we're being readied for some big announcement, I think used to be a little bit fringe. But I ask you, look back over the last 4 years at everything that's happened and the 180-degree flip in government policy on this. And everyone now taking it seriously. I mean, everyone in Congress, Intelligence Committee, Armed Service Committee, the House and the Senate. Doesn't this look a little bit like that kind of scenario that bit by bit it's becoming more and more respectable? You know, suddenly former presidents are giving interviews where they say things like, yes, we see these things and we track them and we don't know what they are. Former directors of national intelligence slipping things into the conversation about satellites, picking up these things. Suddenly, you know, maybe some of this is not too far-fetched. Is all this, is everything that's happened in the last 4 years part of a program just to get us ready for this, just so that when these marvelous instruments do show us other civilizations or their fingerprints or tentacle prints, suction caps, that it won't come as a big culture shock to everyone. And culture shock it may or may not be. I don't know. One of the questions that always comes up, now this is, I won't say this. One final point on Congress. Earlier when I was talking about the media, I mentioned how Tucker Carlson on Fox and Larry King on CNN in different time periods had both become convinced that this was a serious subject that should be put in the mainstream, that we should not be ridiculing it, we should be featuring it and putting it front and center into people's living rooms. And across the years, it's like those two very different political people reached out to each other across that void and shook hands. And yet, I say to you, isn't exactly the same happening now in Congress? Marco Rubio and Kirsten Gillibrand have been two of the most articulate and passionate supporters of this, both writing some of the things that went into the legislation, into the new defense bill, and in articulating some of this to the media. And sometimes you'll see, a couple of interviews where they come out of these classified briefings on UFOs, and they're asked, "Where have you been?" "I've been to a classified briefing on UFOs." "What was said?" "I can't tell you, it's classified." But the fact that you've got Marco Rubio, Republican, Kirsten Gillibrand, Democrat, reaching across their party political differences and coming together to realize that this could be one of the most interesting and important and impactful events in human history, and saying, you know what? Let's set aside the party politics and work together on this. Isn't that good? I think that's good. Some speculation. What might we find out there? I mean, I think sometimes we get so caught up in the question about UFOs. What is it? I mean, you get this skeptic versus believer debate. UFOs are real. No, they're not. It's all misidentifications, hoaxes, and delusions. And then among the believers, you get the different theories about what all this is. Is it extraterrestrial? Is it time travelers from the future? Is it something from another dimension? Is it angels and demons? Or is it crypto-terrestrial, something that shares this earth with it? Or, my personal favorite, is it something so bizarre and surreal and abstract that just as you couldn't explain quantum physics to a chimpanzee, our minds could not just that we don't have the words, but that we don't have the conceptual awareness of the true nature of the UFO phenomenon. If there is ever a sort of dramatic pulling aside of the curtain moment and the true nature of the UFO phenomenon is revealed, might our only response at our current level of human development be, I don't even understand what that is, what it does, where it came from? Is it sentient? Is it biological? Is it post-biological? But even terms like that might not fit the bill for something truly bizarre and abstract. How can you conceive of something that you have not yet discovered and invented? Yes, you can imagine things, but imagination is usually built on the foundations of things that you already have. In a universe nearly 14 billion years old, there might be civilizations, if that's what we're talking about, 1 billion years ahead of us. their technology, to borrow the quote from Arthur C. Clarke, would be indistinguishable from magic. And yet, I say to you, might some of these things be even more abstract than that? Not just, oh yes, it's alien and it's a more advanced civilization, but as I say, I don't understand what I'm looking at. I don't understand what it even is. And that might indeed be the situation. And all of this is going to have a profound aspect, I think, on many aspects of our lives. I don't think you can have a conversation. You know, we get so... My point is that we get sometimes so hung up on the debate about are UFOs real or not, or what are they? We forget to go to the next set of questions. And the next set of questions are the much more interesting ones. Because disclosure or discovery or first contact, however we think it might unfold, and there are lots of variables, it's going to be the end of one chapter and the beginning of a new one. The end of one conversation and the beginning of an entirely new conversation. It's going to be, well, what do we do now? Is this an up-close and personal contact, or is it something distant and remote? Are they interested in us, or do they see us as just like we would regard ants or bacteria or viruses? And of course, bear in mind that there's going to be a lot of variation out there. Remember, 72 trillion, according to some estimates, but I don't know what the true figure is. No one does, of course. But one thing I do know is we are not going to find that there's only one other civilization in the universe. I mean, how crazy would that be? The chances of there being two civilizations, us plus one, in the universe, are as remote, I think, as it's just us. So questions like, you often hear these questions. What do you think the aliens are like? What do you think they look like? What do you think they want? Do you think they're friendly? Or are they hostile? And the answer isn't, well, I think, it's, well, which ones? If there's 72 trillion out there, we'll find a lot of variation. There'll be a huge impact, of course, on religion. That's one of the big, profound questions. I think some of you have heard me previously give a talk about a Royal Society discussion meeting, or in fact 2 meetings I went to in 2010 in the UK. It's the only time that I've really seen quite a heated debate break out at the Royal Society. And of course, it was religion that caused the split, because there were some theologians there who said, we will easily be able to integrate extraterrestrial life into our existing religion. The Catholic Church, for example, has even, the former director of the Vatican Observatory once gave an interview and used, I'm paraphrasing, but the phrase was, there is nothing about the existence of extraterrestrial life that is contrary to our doctrine, because man may place no creative limits upon God. But then the hardcore atheist faction stood up and said, I think you're just talking the talk and saying that you would be able to cope with it, but I think the whole thing would unravel. But even with religion, sometimes it frustrates me that we don't quite get to the really interesting questions, because an interesting question about religions and extraterrestrials is, how will our terrestrial religions be impacted by this? And how will people's individual faith or even the worldviews of people who have no faith. But how will we all be impacted by this? But remember what I said about look for the questions that aren't being asked. The really interesting question about religion is, what concept of religion might extraterrestrials have? Never mind what the effect of the existence of extraterrestrials will do to Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, etc. That's interesting, but it's not as interesting as what might aliens worship? And now, the easy answer is, well, God. But what if we encounter extraterrestrials who, no offense meant by this comment, but who regard religion as superstition from primitive societies, like believing in the Tooth Fairy or Father Christmas? What if we find widespread religions out there that, assuming it's the other way around, or taking the point that there's going to be huge variation, what if we find that there are very deeply entrenched religions out there with all sorts of beliefs and rituals that we regard as stark raving mad, and they come here with 1 billion years head start on us and very much want us to be believers too, in their religion, not in our religion. I'm speculating, but I think it's intriguing. What about, and look at, people ask the obvious questions. What will all this do to politics, religion, science, technology? That's interesting. But what's also interesting to me is the more abstract things. What will extraterrestrial civilizations have? Will they even have it? Will they have, for example, music? Will they have literature? Will they have a distinction between fact and fiction? And if they look at us, will they understand? Bear in mind that extraterrestrials' first knowledge of Earth comes from our radio and TV broadcasts. The old joke about the I Love Lucy. And we saw it in the movie Contact, of course, with the Nuremberg rally being the first thing that the aliens detected. Scary. But what will they make of our religion and our music and our art and our poetry and our literature and all that? What will we make of theirs? Will they understand the difference between fact and fiction? I hope so. Can you imagine them watching like the Nightmare on Elm Street movies or the Halloween movies and saying, wow, some really serious stuff is going on this planet. My goodness, it's dangerous down there. What will they make of the fact that people are fighting and dying in Ukraine and elsewhere, and civilians are being targeted, and yet at the height of this, for a couple of days, all everyone was talking about was how one guy slapped another guy? What will they make of that? This is planet Earth's calling card. And another interesting question, before I wrap up, is have we missed something? People talk about extraterrestrials and advanced civilizations might help us overcome some of our problems, whether it's a cancer cure, whether it's ending starvation, poverty, disease, prejudice, whatever. But have we missed something? I mean, you look at the fundamental basic things that we developed as we became a civilization. We harnessed the ability to make fire and forge tools with it. we cultivated crops so that we could transition from hunter-gatherers to living in communities and then constructing things. We developed the wheel. We developed the written language so that ideas and knowledge could be recorded and kept and passed on. Have we missed something fundamental? It strikes me one of the most interesting things about extraterrestrial visitation might be, hey, you figured out the wheel and the fire, but you didn't figure the blank, which could take us down a whole new road. And I talked about a final thought, then I'm going to play a 2-minute video, and then I'll wrap up, because I think I'm pretty much out of time. I thought of this somewhat bizarrely on the plane as I flew from Tucson, where I now live in the great state of Arizona, to here in the equally great state of Arkansas. And I was thinking about this 72 trillion civilizations business, and I thought, how can you even get your head around that? And how can we speculate? And how different might some of this be? And I thought, yeah, you'll get a lot of variation. But then I thought of something, and I was sitting on the plane and landing and taxiing to the gate, and I thought, it's interesting. We've been building aircraft for 100 years now. And although our aircraft now are, different to the aircraft that we first built, we've kind of, hit a little bit of a niche, certainly with our transportation, that one aircraft pretty much looks like another aircraft. And because the design works, the laws of physics seem to be constant in the observable universe. So thrust, drag, lift, weight, all those things, the way in which things fly, the way in which you transport things by air doesn't really change much. Yeah, you can look at a lot of different shapes of aeroplanes, but yeah, they're pretty much aeroplanes. You can look at helicopters, different sizes and shapes, but yeah, they're kind of like helicopters. And I thought, if there's a lot of diversity in the universe, there'll be a lot of commonality in the universe as well, simply because, even on that scale, if you throw the dice enough times, the same numbers will come up. And, things that can be discovered and invented will be constants throughout the universe. And I was left with this odd thought as I was taxiing to the gate that halfway across the universe, there'll be a planet, maybe many, many planets, where airports, pretty much like what I'm looking at out of the window, will exist. So when people say to you, what do you think an alien planet will look like? A lot of them will look pretty much like this, with airports and catering trucks and jet bridges and people waving the little things. So for anyone that thinks I'll never get to see what an alien world looks like, I think we might be looking at it right now. Or something very much like it. I'm just going to play a video that ties together a few little strands of what I've talked about with ATIP and things. It's a video that it's a trailer for a film I made, a documentary called Aliens at the Pentagon. It's a little kind of dramatic, but yeah, I hope you like it. with that, I will say thank you for listening, and I will leave you with this thought. The question of whether or not we're alone in the universe, and the related question of whether we're being visited, those are some of the biggest and most profound questions we can ask. I think we might be very close to getting answers. Thank you very much.